Tarja Falcha, welcome to today's talk with Fintan O'Toole, which is part of this year's special online virtual Féile and Phobail, brought to you by Féile and Phobail in partnership with St Mary's University College and the Irish News. If you've ended up watching this, the chances are you know why you're here. You're here to listen to Fintan O'Toole, and the chances are you know who he is without me introducing him, but sure, it'd be a bit churlish not to say a word or two. Fintan works for the Irish Times. He writes for the Irish Times, the Guardian, Statesman. You're as likely to hear him on the radio and see him on the TV as read about him in print. And he covers a wide aspect of issues, especially in relation to Southern society, about Southern politics, society, culture. I suppose everything from Jedward through Brexit to most recently coronavirus. Your article on Jedward, by the way, was one of the best I've ever read. Not just the best of yours, but the best ever. So that's me ingratiated with Fintan to start with. I suppose if he was in continental Europe, we'd call him a public intellectual, but I don't know if we have a term for that in the Irish context. But look, what's going to happen now is I'm going to hand you over to Fintan. He's going to speak for a while, and then we'll use what time we've left to engage in a little bit of a discussion, hopefully. Okay, Fintan O'Toole, over to you.
Thanks very much, Bill, and thanks to Féile for carrying on under these difficult circumstances. I know it takes a huge amount of effort from people to make this happen, and I'm really grateful that they've done it. I'm sure, like all of you watching, I miss the physical events, and one of the things this strange period has reminded us of is how desperately we need the company of each other at these kinds of events. They serve all sorts of functions, you know, and one of them is just to be together and to feel that we have things in common, even if we're going to argue over them. We're capable of doing that. So I look forward very much, if I'm invited back, to being with the whole Féile community next year. But I hope this will help to fill the gap a little bit. I'm just going to talk for a little while, really, about maybe one of the big things that's on everybody's mind, which is how much does the coronavirus change things in terms of the way we think about politics and society and who we are. And I suppose the obvious thing to say is that I have absolutely no idea, no more than anybody else, right? So I think we all know that we're not at the end of a process, right? We're still very much in the middle of it. We don't know how long this thing is going to last. We don't know how a vaccine will work or how it might play out. We don't know how much economic damage is going to be done in the meantime. I think everybody's aware that the economic damage will be in proportion to the success of our societies in dealing with the virus. And how all that plays out, we really don't know. But what we do know is that things like this change the way societies work. This is history, and it's history which, you know, in that sort of Chinese curse, you know, may you live in interesting times. We're living in interesting times, and we can be pretty sure from historical precedents that this will have consequences. We just don't really know quite what those consequences are. And I suppose we should be careful about not assuming that those consequences are benign. I mean, first of all, of course, for an awful lot of people, there's nothing benign about any of this. You know, thousands and thousands of people, even in our part of the world, have lost loved ones. People have had the most horrendous experiences of not being able to be with their aged parents or even with their children who are dying. People have not been able to go to funerals. You know, so this has been a time of trauma, and that trauma is going to be felt. And it's going to be felt, of course, more by the more vulnerable people, as is always the case with these. We don't really know even what's going on in the heads of our kids and how, you know, what kind of effects this sort of stuff is going to have on them. But not all the effects are going to be good. So I want to be very careful about, not appearing that I'm sort of being a Pollyanna-ish about this and saying it's all great. And I'm very aware of that. Also, even at a collective level, people are not rational. Societies don't always work in the way you think they're going to work. If you look back to the parallel that's been drawn a lot, which is with the 1918 horrendous flu epidemic, which was on a scale even much larger than what we're experiencing now, and it kills more people than had actually died in the First World War, which is hard to get your head around. You would think that might have had a kind of sobering effect on society, but what comes after that, the Roaring Twenties, the period of appalling capitalist excess, of the ultra rich, the Great Gatsby world of the rich celebrating their difference from everybody else. Remember the Great Gatsby, which has that line about the rich are different from everybody else. And so irresponsibility in many ways followed from that terrible collective experience, and then of course that leads us into fascism and totalitarianism, the Holocaust and the Second World War. So I don't want to depress people by suggesting we're in for something like that. I just want to suggest that we've got to be careful about assuming that the consequences of this thing we're going through are going to be positive, or that we will learn good lessons collectively from it. However, having put in those qualifications, just to cover my behind, I do think so far, with the qualifications and with the sense of not knowing where we're going, I think we've learned some positive things. If you go back to January, for example, when we were just beginning to pay attention to this virus, although we now know that it was in Europe even in December, but it really came to public consciousness in mid-January, I suppose. We were still, at this part of the world, tending to be looking on it as a Chinese phenomenon or as an Asian phenomenon. And if you go back to that period, it seems like years and years ago now, so much has happened since, but if you go back to it, one of the cliches that was being used, and it was almost a kind of standard comment on what was going on, was that this was a crisis that suited authoritarian regimes. So people were looking at China and they were saying, my God, the power of the Chinese Communist Party, they can just order massive numbers of people in, they can build hospitals in a week, but also they have authoritarian powers, they can arrest people, they can lock down, they can do curfews, they can do all sorts of stuff that democracies can't do. And one of the fears was that the way this virus plays out is going to further enhance the move which has been underway towards a kind of authoritarianism, towards an undermining of democratic values. And I think one thing we can say is that that's not what's happened. That's not the way it's played out. We now know, of course, that China's authoritarian system, while it may have had certain advantages, also, of course, had huge disadvantages, like lying, covering up the existence of the virus for quite a long time from its own population, persecuting whistleblowers, medics who were simply just trying to raise the alarm. And we also know that even in Asia, so it's not just a cultural thing, even in other Asian countries, which are more democratic, we know that they did even better. That countries like Taiwan, like South Korea, like Singapore, have managed the crisis extremely well. So this sort of notion that only authoritarian regimes can meet crises like this has, I think, been blown out of the water. And not just that, but I think the crisis has exposed the weakness of the wave of authoritarian ethno-nationalism that has sort of swept a lot of the Western world. You don't have to be particularly political about this to just look at the the evidence, the empirical evidence, which societies have managed this worst, and which governments indeed have managed it worst. And the governments that have managed it worst are, by and large, with one or two strange exceptions like Sweden, which we won't go into, but by and large, they are the regimes that are part of this wave of populism, to use that term, although it's a bit problematic. The strong men have all turned out to be weak, and disastrously so, at enormous human cost to their own citizens. And so if you were to say, there's lots of contenders for appalling performance in relation to this, but if you were to say which are the worst, you would probably look at the numbers and say the four worst are India and Russia, but particularly the United States and Britain. And from our perspective in our part of the world, it's very, very striking that it's Boris Johnson's regime and Donald Trump's regime which have managed to kill their own people on a mass level. I don't take pleasure in saying this. These are human beings. This is not a numbers game. But the objective estimates, just in terms of Britain, from Neil Ferguson, who's kind of regarded as the main statistical epidemiologist who's been at the heart of a lot of the discussion of the coronavirus. I mean, Ferguson estimated a couple of weeks ago that the failures of the British government to introduce lockdown when it should have done have cost at least 20,000 lives. I mean, I don't think we've come to terms mentally with the scale of that, with what this means. Trump has been killing his own people on an equally massive scale, probably, and continues to do so. The disaster that is coronavirus in the United States is still unfolding. The numbers of cases and deaths are still rising, and we don't really know where this is going to end in the United States. But it's going to have been a horrendous episode in their history, largely, to a very, very large extent, because of Trump and the Republican Party regime. And its nexus, its broader nexus, Fox News, Rupert Murdoch, So all these people who've driven this sort of reactionary moment have turned out to be absolute failures at the most basic duty any government has, which is to keep its people safe. And we maybe just might ask ourselves, why is that? What's the connection? And I think there are three obvious things that are very much features of this reactionary wave. On the one side, that Brexit's part of, that Trump is part of, and lots of other stuff going on around the world. The features of that, and that also then map onto disastrous performance in relation to the pandemic. The first of these, of course, is incompetence. Let's not be shy about naming it for what it is. These are people who are not fit to govern. Government is a serious business, and it becomes very, very serious when people's lives are immediately at stake on this scale. And it's an interesting kind of incompetence, right? Which is it's a known incompetence. So the backers of Brexit, the backers of Boris Johnson, for example, all knew absolutely that Johnson is not fit to govern. I mean, Kenneth Clarke, the former Tory Chancellor, said that Johnson was not fit to run a whelk stall. And that's almost literally true. I don't think I'd buy a whelk from Boris Johnson. I wouldn't trust it. I wouldn't trust it to be a whelk. I mean, and this is, I'm making light of this, but this is a reality that is really quite remarkable. It's not that Johnson and the crew around him, Dominic Cummings, that these people turned out to be incompetent. It's that, they were there to disrupt. The whole point of them coming to power was to, produce a shock, to disrupt the system in order that that could then be exploited for other purposes, which we don't need to go into. And of course, Trump is the same. I mean, nobody in their right mind thought that Trump was a fit person to actually govern. And you had two things going on there. You had ruling elites, oligarchs, who are ideologically driven to destroy government. Right? So, the big right-wing movement is government is bad. The less of it there is, the better. And therefore, actually putting incompetence into government is a good thing, because it helps to discredit and destroy the state. So you had that kind of oligarchic tendency. And then on the part of a lot of their voters, you had a sense that it doesn't matter, that government doesn't do anything for me anyway, therefore I may as well stick two fingers up to everybody by putting in these kind of clownish figures. It's actually this kind of a thrill in it. But the thrill wears off when you're faced with a literally existential crisis. The second aspect of this reactionary wave that's completely relevant is exceptionalism, right? So what people like Trump and Johnson have manipulated and stoked is a sense of national exceptionalism, right? We're different. Now, look, every nation has its own bits of exceptionalism, right? It comes with the territory. And we Irish, well, whatever brand we are, we have our competing exceptionalisms of our different brands of Irishness, So look, it's not that anybody is innocent of this, but sane polities keep it within bounds. Right? You don't take it that seriously, and you certainly don't allow your policy in an extreme crisis to be driven by the sense that we're not like anybody else. And yet, if you look at both Johnson and Trump, exceptionalism is exactly what they've brought to bear on all of this. In the case of both of them, remember, these were societies which had huge advantages going into this crisis. They had lots of time, which was an incredibly precious asset to have. They were forewarned. People could see this coming. Even if you were very dull, you could see it coming from the middle of January. Right? And they wasted that time. They had lots of money, and the money has been used very, very badly. And they both are countries that have huge intellectual and scientific assets. Some of the best universities in the world, some of the best medics in the world. Some of those, they ought to have been in a position to be able to resist the pandemic successfully. And yet they've become two of the worst countries in the world. And exceptionalism is a big part of that, right? We don't need to talk about Trump's exceptionalism, make America great, it's all about America. But just look at Johnson, which was this idea that everything had to be seen through the prism that Britain didn't have anything to learn from anybody else. Now, the intelligent response of any government to this pandemic was to just look at what was happening in other countries. If you had a couple of months, the obvious way to use that time was what's happening elsewhere? How is this still relatively unknown virus unfolding? What effects is it having? And also particularly what policies are working and what policies are not working. This was if there was ever a time when you did not need exceptionalism, this was it, right? You need to be saying, actually, we're human beings. This thing affects human beings. Let's learn and let's adapt. Britain, very, very sadly, for so many of our friends and neighbours, did the opposite. Everything had to be seen through this idea that, well, British people are different. We love liberty. We're not like other people. Measures that the Chinese would put up with would never be put up with in England. But also remedies, like we couldn't just, we need inhalers in our hospitals. That was a big problem, right? We couldn't just start out by saying, okay, the inhaler has been invented. There's lots of them. Let's license them and make more. No, a program had to be launched to develop special, unique new British inhalers. New ventilators. Sorry, it has to be put into hospitals. Everything had to be done. The tracing app couldn't be the same as the tracing app that everybody else was using. It had to be a new one, which of course then eventually ended up getting abandoned. So you get all these policies which are complete wastes of time and money, but more importantly in this crisis, a waste of attention. Not focusing on what needs to be done because you're off, trying to look for what will prove our specific greatness in this time. Not thinking about what might prove not just your competence might be good enough, or your ability to actually save your citizens. But when you're off thinking about greatness, you don't get this done. And the third thing, which has been disastrous, is truth. What this reactionary moment is based around is the subversion, not just of truth itself, because that's part of politics, and we know that, but it's the subversion of the idea that truth exists at all. The whole strategy, which does go back to fascism, and to Soviet totalitarianism, and totalitarian systems operate by gaslighting, by saying if you put out enough misinformation, the difference between information and lies ceases to exist, and people no longer know the difference. And also tied into this is the authoritarian notion that reality is what I say it is. I construct reality, and this is all very fine and well when you're coming to power on a populist wave, but then you're faced with something like the coronavirus, which actually exists. It is real. There is information about it. Not only do you need to know what's happening, but you also need to be able to communicate in a trustworthy way to your citizens what they need to do about it. Trust in the idea that there is reality becomes absolutely crucial. And this has been undermined in the United States, in Britain, and in India, in a number of other societies that have had this kind of same wave of authoritarian exceptionalism. So that's why these regimes have done so horrendously badly at such awful cost to their own citizens. Let's think then about the other side of this. Right? So I think the coronavirus is not just that it has undermined and exposed the pretensions of a lot of these reactionary governments. It's that it's actually brought back to the surface some stuff that we should always have known, but that's been deliberately obscured by neoliberalism, really, by the whole orthodoxy that emerged from the Reagan-Thatcher revolution in 1979, 1980. One of these things that's been obscured is that health is not private. Health is not just an individual matter, it's a public good, and it's interdependent. Everybody always knew this. This has been known by humanity going back to, as far back as we know, that human beings have been leaving us records of what they thought. People knew this, particularly since people started gathering in cities. They've known that I'm not going to be healthy if my friends are dying in a plague. As science advanced, people know, well, I'm not going to be healthy if the water isn't clean. I can't have my own private water supply. My kids are not going to be healthy if the school they go to is rat infested. A huge amount of human progress, and progress for ordinary people, has been driven by the realization of the rich that even they can't completely cut themselves off from the idea of health as a public good. And of course, one of the things that's been driven very, very strongly by commercial interests really since the 1980s is the idea that health can be privatized. If you look at health promotion messages, right, even over the last 20, 30 years, and it's not that they're wrong, they're all absolutely accurate, mostly, but it's just the way they've been emphasized. It's all about you, what you can do, your body, your diet, your exercises, all that kind of stuff, which is all perfectly right. But none of it really has been about public health and about the idea of health as a public good. And the coronavirus comes along and taps us on the shoulder and says, by the way, you've only been able to think about health as a private thing because you've been living in a very lucky place at a lucky time when there hasn't been a pandemic. Pandemics are recurrent things in human history, and they always remind us that we are interdependent for our lives and our health on each other and on society. And a corollary of this, I think, has been that as the coronavirus has reminded us of these things, it's also reminded us that social solidarity still exists. A lot of intellectual commentary over the last 20, 30 years, again, not inaccurately, but it's tended to focus on the loss of what's called social capital, on the way in which we're cut off from each other, or the way in which we're, being atomized and individualized, and we don't really know each other, and we don't care about each other anymore. And while some of that is undoubtedly true, it turns out there's a lot of it left, right? That this process of destroying our sense of social solidarity, hasn't gone as far as we might have feared. The obvious thing we've seen in the pandemic is, first of all, the fact that we care about each other. There's been an overwhelming sense of public grief. People really feeling the loss of the citizens that we're losing, whether we know them individually or not. People looking out for each other over the lockdown, but also a realization that this distinction between the individual and society, on which so much kind of right-wing thinking is based. Margaret Thatcher famously saying there's no such thing as society, there are individuals and families, that's it, there's no society. As if any individual ever came into the world without a society of parents and neighbors and friends and family and doctors and nurses and everything around them. And we exist as social creatures, it's obvious. But this is exactly what's being denied so much in the way we're supposed to think. And we've been reminded in the most stark way that actually the distinction between us as individuals and the society in which we live, even at the literally existential level, even at the level of do I live or do I die, that's a social question, right? In a pandemic, how we behave with and around each other is what's going to matter. And the other thing that's come with this then is public service. How much denigration of public service have we seen over and over and over again in the media, in politics? The image of public service has been the image of parasites. Public servants are basically parasites on the real economy, which is the private economy, and public service just draws money out of the private economy, and the more public servants there are, and the more they're paid, the worse things are. Again, instinctively, we all know this is not true. We know it's nonsense, but nonsense has extraordinary power. And one of the things the pandemic crisis has done is reminded us how fundamentally dependent we are on not just public service in the sense of organizations and in the sense of the institutions, but in the really fundamental, basic sense of having people who are willing to do this work at great cost, and sometimes at the ultimate cost to themselves, because it's the right thing to do, because they believe in it, because they actually are committed to their fellow human beings. Vast numbers of people do this. And they're not, by the way, just the highly paid and respected, epidemiologists and consultants and even nurses. the cleaners who've been taking enormous risks in our hospitals and in our care homes. And also, even the idea of public service itself, I think, has extended. The person from the supermarket who could deliver your shopping during the lockdown, to me, is a public servant. You know, what they're doing is an immense public service of feeding people, and all the people involved in that chain of keeping food supply going for us. You know, so our sense of public service, our sense of the worth of work and certain kinds of work, I think, has changed profoundly, and the visibility of some people. You know, we suddenly have to think about who cleans the space, whether it's a hospital or an office or a shop or a street. These kinds of work, which have been rendered invisible, and the people who do them have been rendered invisible, I think have come to the surface for us again. And all of this has led to a re-establishment of the centrality of government. The whole movement of the reactionary right has been, as I said earlier, to attempt to undermine the legitimacy and validity of government, for obvious reasons. If you're in a polluting industry, for example, the last thing you want is government regulation. You know, if you're running banks that have, as we learned in 2008, the potential to destroy our societies, you don't want government because it stops you getting rich quick at whatever cost to individuals and society. So this assault on government, you know, has been very, very powerful and very deeply motivated. But what happens when you face existential danger? What you're left with is government. And not only in the strict sense of being the only set of institutions which can protect us from the pandemic, but also, of course, the only set of institutions which can keep an economy going. The private economies have been devastated during the pandemic and still are. And we're faced with the fact that suddenly it's necessary for the state to become the employer of last resort, effectively. So states, both the UK government and the Irish government and governments all over the world, are employing effectively vast numbers of people. They're subsidizing their wages to a huge extent, and will probably have to continue to do so for quite a long time. They're also subsidizing most private businesses of small and medium scale. The UK government has introduced, for example, credit guarantees of 100%. So business can borrow 100% of whatever it needs from a bank, and the state will guarantee every cent of that. The Irish government's introduced an 80% guarantee this week. So the distinction between the private economy and the public economy turns out to be, under this pressure, rather academic, actually. The whole narrative that the right has put forward, which is the private economy is the thing that creates everything, creates all wealth, creates all value, and keeps everything going, and then everything else is kind of parasitic on that, has been completely blown away. It is the collective which sustains the private economy at every single level, including the fact that there is no distinction between public health and economic wealth. You know, maybe some of you remember your granny saying your health is your wealth. Well, your granny knew what she was talking about. You know, wealth is impossible without health. It is not possible for people to make lots of money off a private economy in the middle of a plague. You know, there will always be gougers who will find some way to turn human misery to profit, but on the mass, right, the economy depends on health, and health is a public asset. It belongs to us, and it's part of our interdependence. And in this rediscovery of big government, right, of the necessity for government, I think there are two important things have happened. One is this has also blown away the whole justification for Brexit. Now, one might say that was a house of cards that wasn't all that hard, didn't need a pandemic to come along and blow it down. But at the heart of the argument for Brexit, right, is the idea that the European Union is an evil institution which has destroyed national government. Right? That things that should be the domain of national governments have been taken away by this European superstate. Just look what's happened with the pandemic. Under pressure, what happens? National government, national government, national government. Every national government has introduced its own policies, has sealed its own borders, has citizens have looked to their own governments to be the ones that actually respond. Primarily, the European Union is important, and hopefully it will get more important, at least for those of us who are fortunate enough to be still in it, in terms of the refinancing of economies. But it's not been a huge player, really, in terms of the response. And that's a good thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It just shows us that this mythology about the fact that, you know, our national sovereignty was being taken away from us and all that stuff is just that. When push comes to shove, as it has, is governments that still have the power, and they have the power which can be used either benignly or malignly, you know, and it's the responsibility of those governments whether the outcomes are malign or benign, as we've been talking about. So that myth, I think, is one of the things that's been exposed in this crisis. But the other thing, of course, that's being exposed, and I'm not going to go on too long about this, but it's really worth just, you know, sitting back for a moment and thinking about austerity. You know, austerity was imperative. It wasn't that anybody wanted to do austerity. It was just no choice. You know, from 2008 onwards. But both, you know, in slightly different ways in the regime in London and the regime that the south of Ireland was caught in under the European Union, you know, they were austerity regimes, and the motto was, well, the government hasn't run out of compassion; it's run out of money. We'd love to do all those things and, you know, feed kids and you know, have some kind of social justice, but unfortunately we can't because we don't have enough money. There is no magic money tree, right? And of course, what we've seen is that there's a forest of magic money trees. You know, that when you get rid of the fetish of austerity, you can then say, let's do the sensible thing here. The only way to save our economies and to save our societies is by pumping money into them. What do? You borrow the money, right? So the whole fetish about deficits and deficit financing can be switched off overnight, you know, when it suits. And this is not to say that there are not important questions about public spending and about responsibility and about spending the money properly and all of that, or about, you know, I'm not saying infinite levels of debt are a great thing, I'm not saying any of that. But what it does show is that this was a fetish, you know, and the fashion has changed. When you find Germany pushing for the European Union to borrow on a vast scale and pump money into European economies, you know that the world has shifted. Right? And this is going to have huge consequences as well. So where we end up, and I finish on this, I think, is that we end up with a really very profound reinforcement of a sense of the collective, a really profound reinforcement of the importance of government, a really important reinforcement of the centrality of public service, and a really important reinforcement of the interdependence of economy and society. And these are big things to have happened. None of this means that a progressive outcome, a decent outcome from all of this is inevitable. But it does mean, I think, that the argument is now there to be made, that we can organize our societies better, that we can return to a sense of what our priorities as human beings and as societies ought to be. And that out of this terrible time, we can actually begin to make a better world.
I'm not surprised that was great. Lots of food for thought there. We're 3 weeks away from, as we record this, from when it will be broadcast, but I think you've laid out a possible path ahead that goes way beyond those 3 weeks, way beyond this year, perhaps into all sorts of places. And I think that I was struck by ultimately how upbeat you were in the whole thing. Not on a facile way, not in a sort of a Walt Disney movie sort of way, but in the sense of saying that certain things, certain trends no longer make sense, whether that's the trend to less government or the trend to austerity or whatever. That struck me. I was also struck by your point there also about the importance of society. I don't know if you saw earlier, well, maybe a couple of months ago when it was all starting, there was a song was going around Facebook by a Portuguese singer called Cristóvão, called Andro Tudo Bene, Everything Will Be All Right. And it's got 2 lovely lines in it. One day we'll remember the hardest of times when distance meant love and it kept us alive. Now, I think you caught that same sense in what you were saying there. Look, as you know yourself from your appearances at the Féile before, you usually at this point will be subject to a barrage of questions from a very vocal, able, intelligent, and sometimes stroppy audience. But you've only got me. And there are sort of 2 things I'd like to cover in the short distance. We've got a short time we've left. I'm going to bring one in from a bit out in left field, if you don't mind. One of the arguments about Brexit in relation to this island was that it had speeded up some sort of momentum towards, if not a reunified country, at least the ability to speak in respectable circles about the possibility of a reunified country. It speeded up that debate. Now, Republicans would tell you it speeded up more than that debate. It speeded up the inevitability of unification. But even leaving that aside, it speeded up that debate. What has coronavirus done to that? Has it put it on hold? Has it brought it to a complete stop? Has it somehow, a bit down the line, even more increased that or reinvigorated that momentum? What's your opinion on that?
I can think of nobody better to stand in for a stroppy, intelligent, vocal audience than yourself. It's a great question. I think, Bill, there's 2 things I would say. One is that coronavirus, and again, I just stress, I say this with just absolute horror and sadness, but it has exposed the deep, deep flaws in the British state, right? The existing British state. It seemed to me obvious at the time of Brexit that it wasn't just leaving the European Union, right? That this was going to tear apart the other union, and I think as time goes on, the realization that the regime, this terrible regime in my view, the Cummings regime, we should really call it the Dominic Cummings regime, in London, is murderously incompetent. It's not capable of doing, as I said, the most basic stuff of protecting its own citizens. That has to further this undermining of the authority of that state. Even if this were not happening, possibly on top of a chaotic end to the transition period of Brexit at the end of the year. We've seen very strikingly with the devolved governments, the devolved administrations going their own way, having to, in a sense, step in and say, actually, we're taking charge here. I think, this is particularly obvious in many ways with Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland. Far higher levels of trust, for example, among people in Scotland in what the Scottish government's done than there are among people in England in what the English government's done. Obviously the government in Belfast, government in Cardiff, they've taken their own approaches. That was unthinkable 10 years ago. I mean, the idea that a public health crisis, people say, come on, it's a public health crisis. It's not political in that sense, right? It shouldn't involve that. So that I think highlights the question, which, I think I spoke about this last year, that we're used to thinking about Irish unification as an Irish nationalist question, but it's English nationalism still, and all this exceptionalism is kind of working its way through. But on the island of Ireland context, look, I really don't want to. I don't think it's right to politicize the pandemic in that narrow sense, right? However, what I think is obvious to anybody, whether you're a nationalist or unionist, is that this island is a single phytosanitary space. If we can say that for animals, it's defined in law even before Brexit, as a single space for animal welfare and animal health. Well, surely human beings maybe deserve the same consideration as animals do, and having an island status is actually a real advantage in these kinds of crises, and will continue to be so. What seems to be clear to me is that this is exactly one of the times when this shouldn't be about the South saying we're terrific and the North should join us. It should be about saying, actually, you know what, we have a really insane health system, and for all the faults of the health system in the North, a national health service system is a better system, and we need to move towards an all Ireland health service. And I say that without prejudice to the questions of United Ireland or the broader questions of political unity. It's just an obvious thing for the benefit of everybody who shares the space on the island. So I think those two things weigh on the broader question, which is the necessity to engage. I don't think the public in general will thank anybody for trivializing or overly narrowly politicizing the crisis. But I think everybody does understand that a lot of these other things are also playing out. And the necessity to talk about how we share the space has absolutely not diminished at all during this crisis. And I would argue for those reasons that it's actually become even greater.
Okay. Completely different one. I heard someone say this, I can't remember who, a couple of months ago when this was all starting, that one of the sort of, as it were, handmaidens of this whole crisis, now not the disease itself, but the whole, everything that followed the handmaidens, was actually neoliberalism. When you move into a neoliberal globalized world where you open up free movement allegedly of capital, labor, finance, everything else, you create a huge big open space which a pandemic can really take advantage of, even in terms of the ease of air travel, things like that. So that inadvertently neoliberalism was part of the cause, and that this person was arguing that therefore neoliberalism and globalization will be one of the things that suffers out of this. Would you agree with this? Or to put it a slightly different way, more simply, can capital recover out of this?
Yeah, I think there's two separate questions there. One is I'm a bit skeptical about the argument that the pandemic itself was kind of caused by neoliberalism. We've had pandemics throughout human history, right? In my previous life, I was a drama critic. One of the great plays is Oedipus the King, written about 500 BC in Athens. There's a plague. The plague has come from somewhere else. Plagues always come from somewhere else. I mean, the Black Death probably, where did it start? In Mongolia or somewhere. Once you have trade, of any kind, you can't stop human beings moving around. They've always done it. They always will do it. Yes, of course, modernity, right? The way we travel now has speeded up the pandemic. It's great, and it does absolutely have implications for things like air travel and cheap air travel. The way we've thought about it as a commodity, absolutely, I think we have to think about those things. But I think even if we had different economic systems, if those involved global trade and movements of people, we will get pandemics. It's just there. However, I think the second part that I do agree, whether capital can recover. I mean, I think the question is really whether the pandemic speeds up what was an existential question anyway, right? So the big thing the pandemic has done is it's almost kind of brought to the fore in a different form the question of human survival. Right? The question of human survival was already there for any sentient person, right, who's paying any attention to the climate crisis, right? That we're in trouble as a species. You know, we're in like really, really profound trouble. I mean, right up to the point of an open question about whether or not civilization as we understand it can continue if we carry on abusing the planet. And that abuse of the planet is tied up, of course, with the rapaciousness of a kind of feral form of capitalism, absolutely. And the pandemic has just reminded us of that vulnerability. And again, without at all diminishing the trauma and the sorrow of the pandemic itself, we could be lucky in one way, right? If this is the thing that finally wakes us up to say, we're a vulnerable species, and that vulnerability is not compatible with rapacious, short-term pursuit of profit to the exclusion of everything else. If that's what capital and capitalism means, it's not compatible with human existence, right? Because if we carry on doing that, we're not going to be around, and frankly, I don't think the planet would mourn us very much if we carry on with the kind of attitudes that are implicit in that greed and rapaciousness.
Yeah, I would agree there. My own view, I know people came to hear you, but sure, they're stuck now.
Oh no, it's much more fun.
They can turn off. My own view is that capital always has ways of bouncing back. And one of the ways in which I think about it is that, you know, the way in which we so many of us who can, we're working from home. Now, what that has meant is that, you know, the broadband, paying for the broadband, paying for the heat if there is any, paying for the electricity, paying for all those things has been derogated to us as workers, right? Now, a capitalist might say, hey, that's handy. I don't need to build all these big glass towers in the centre of Dusseldorf or Dublin or anything else. If I can get all my workers to work for the same price or less as before, and they take part of the burden of paying for it. And I just think there are ways in which capital will find advantages to continue doing the rapacious thing after this. They mightn't be the ones that got that warm feeling of togetherness in society. There's my opinion.
Yeah, you know, it's very hard to argue with that on the precedent, but I think this is why it's crucial that we talk about the fact that society is changing, and who wins and who loses, who are the beneficiaries. You know, even if you take, I think exactly just what we're doing now. You know, who's going to benefit from the fact that we can do this? On the one hand, I think most of us are incredibly grateful for the fact that we have these technologies. Yes. Can you imagine what this period would have been like if we were not able to talk to our loved ones, you know, at least using these kinds of technologies, these kinds of forms? It would have been unbearable, I think, for so many of us. So yes, we have all the benefits of the technologies and of the possibility of working from home and all the rest of it. But this will involve huge reorganization of society, of work, of physical space, of cities. And this is where the politics of it really is going to be absolutely crucial. You know, if governments are getting bigger and more powerful, well, we have to make bloody well sure that the governments are on the side of the mass of people in terms of protecting their private space. Like, and this can be done. Like, just to take a really simple example, the French government's introduced a law which says your employer cannot hassle you after working hours if you're working from home. You know. Yeah. Like, this is really important. You have a right not to respond to an email at bloody midnight from your boss, you know? So we need law. You know, I'm an old-fashioned statist in this sense. You need law to come in and say, no, you bloody well cannot harass that person. Their working hours are whatever, 10 to 6 or whatever they are. And when they're not working, they're not working. And that includes not being on video calls to you and not answering your emails and not, contacting clients or whatever else the thing is supposed to be. So law can work, regulation can work, government can work, but it has to be clear. It has to be on the side of the ordinary individual and the worker, for the worker to get the benefits that can come out of this. Some of this could be terrific, for family life, for work-life balance, for all those kind of things, for not having to sit in, and particularly this is a huge problem in the South, the degradation of people's lives by commuting, the rents that people are paying. Wouldn't it be fantastic if so many of those, if you come to Dublin and you look at those cranes everywhere, we're all building office blocks. Well, actually, maybe turn them all into lovely inner city apartments for ordinary people. Bring life back to so many parts of our cities which are dead after 6 o'clock, because they're just all offices and everybody's gone home. They've all gone into cars to commute for an hour and a half out to County Meath or County Wexford. That's no way to live. And we have an opportunity here actually to say, let's take control of this and take control of it on behalf of ordinary people.
Fintan, you've cheered me up. Pandemic or not. No, it's good. It's to repeat, it's not sort of wishy-washy thinking. I wouldn't have expected that from you, of course. It's profound, but it's also positive. There's a cheery message in there. Look, we're unfortunately out of time. A minute or two to go. There's only set slots that we have here. I'd just like to congratulate you and say that you passed the audition, and on the basis of this, you will be invited back next year. So
that's a great relief.
And hopefully in the flesh and not in this form, because we can have a coffee or a pint afterwards or whatever. Thanks for your thoughts. Thanks for the profundity of them as usual. Keep thinking, keep writing, keep cheering us up, keep making us think. Fintan O'Toole, thank you.
Thanks very much. I look forward to seeing everybody next year.